Thank you, John Louis, for the introduction, and I'll hand over to Olvia around halfway through, and then I'll take back the presentation for the final elements. We've also got some input from the inspectional side, but I'll deliver those some of those slides on behalf of Emil, Schwan, and Virva, who are just sitting over there. So that's in terms of practicalities. So first of all, let me thank the organizers for giving us an opportunity to share, because I think this has been a fabulous opportunity to learn just in the work groups themselves how we approach things and how we learn from each other. And this has helped us hugely in how we identify what topics we want to cover during this case study to try and take us a step forward. And we should always really learn that. And I think the comments by Jean-Louis and Georges earlier about these are taking steps forward. So we should be looking forward as to how we can improve. I'll introduce the team. I'll talk about the products. This will cover 2 products that we've had approved in Europe, and those products have also had approvals in other countries, the US and Japan. I'll touch on. We'll cover some of the review outcomes. I think that's important for people to see as to what approaches we've tried with these products and what has been successful and what is still a difficult area going forward. And from this, we've distilled down to 2 topic areas for discussion. This is around risk assessment, which I think you'll have seen through the introductions is key in how we communicate what our development story is to the regulators. And lifecycle management. I think we've had lots and lots of talks about theoretical approaches with regards to quality by design. Lifecycle management is where it becomes real. And that's where we find out how successful or not our filings have been and where may be some issues still to work out. So our regulatory team, Olvia, you'll see in a moment. Jobst, unfortunately, is not with us. And Emil and Virva have helped us from the inspectorate side. We've got a team from AstraZeneca, so Tova, Dave, Ali, and John Gilday are in the audience. So I'm sure they'll make themselves known to you, and you can ask them lots of questions, because they probably know more about this than me. Okay, so as I said, this case study is about 2 approved MAAs. Oops, sorry, this is a bit jumpy. Both products, small molecule, immediate release tablets. And what is it that we were looking to achieve through these submissions? Well, obviously, we were trying to understand our product and improve our process robustness, understand clinical performance, and develop appropriate control strategies through that understanding. But also, I take you back, we're here to learn about quality by design. What does this mean in terms of the regulator-industry interface? How do we learn from this? And really, we were looking at how can we enable the manufacturing side to make improvements to our products without unnecessary oversight from the regulatory authorities. That's not to say that we don't want to share information. We just want to be effective in how we achieve that. During the early days of understanding quality by design, we took a different interpretation of that. And I think there's been a lot of changes in how we've looked at some of the concepts that have been developed through Q8 over the development of that guidance. And our perception is that maybe that caused confusion, and we have to learn from that, because we think it complicated the review, and it complicated in-house discussions as well. For product A, we wanted to use that as a test case. This is our product that we took through the FDA pilot program and then had discussions with Europe afterwards. This was a very robust product and very high quality. So we felt it allowed us to explore sort of how we could reduce the reliance of end product testing and develop maybe different types of control strategies to support that product. Product B was slightly more traditional, although we did propose some design spaces and extrapolations, and you can see some things there. Our reviews were product B relatively consistent with what we'd seen in the past. I think as Jean-Louis and Georges has mentioned, with one of our products, we had a lot of questions and a lot of data required to support some of those proposals. And as you've seen, maybe some of that was justified. But that was a huge challenge, not just for the company, but also, I would suspect, for the assessors that had to go through that data as well. Now, I don't believe that's really where we want to be, and I think you took that from some of the comments from the chairman. But it did follow the points to consider document. So I think that's an element that we have to look at. When we've developed these guidance documents to help us in an earlier phase, do we need to look at those documents? Do we need to adapt them, or adapt at least our interpretation of them? And this has made us adapt our approach to our submissions. As I said, we had learning as well, but also we don't have the pressure on the industry is huge, and we cannot consume the kind of resource that some of these activities require and maintain effective. So this is real. But the learning is that some of the expectations have adapted through this period. I've been talking to some people here that I've worked with over 4 or 5 years, and our perceptions, what we had then, are very different now. So again, some of the case studies that we look at now, our approaches may be different nowadays than they were whenever those assessments were also conducted. So looking at the review outcomes, what was accepted? Well, we proposed some wide process parameter ranges for both product and substance. They were supported by DOEs, and they were accepted by the agencies. The specification limits that we introduced for most of our intermediates and our starting materials were based on process capability, not the previous batch history. We provided lots of data around impurity handling and purge. They were accepted, and that included genotoxic impurities. And that was a difficult issue for people during that period. So these are all major positives. We dropped testing for intermediates where we defined that that was not critical to ensure the quality of the product. Again, a good success. Reduced testing of the API on some quality attributes because of upstream testing. And then, what were the difficult issues? Well, we've heard about process parameters, reducing the number of process parameters. We were looking at that as maybe a mechanism to avoid unnecessary interaction with regulators whenever we made post-approval changes. I think that element of it will be a discussion point. We accept that there's a requirement to share that data in the file. We just need to know how to handle it in the lifecycle environment. Single-sided ranges for process parameters. We were trying to do that to avoid including non-critical parameters in the discussion. When you have a critical parameter, you may have a range that's critical and one that's not. So again, that will be a topic that comes up. Regionally, Georges and Jean-Louis talked about sort of how this works when we look at global products. And some of those reviews were very similar. But again, we've seen some very significant expectations in the MAA and JNDAs required, and I've touched on the points to consider. But this is a point I've made very recently, and I will continue to make within my own company, is when we put forward complex control strategies and maybe a lot of risk in our files, we should expect that regulators will take a different interpretation of those risks, and that could impact our supply chains. So we talk a lot about harmonization in within the agencies. We should look at ourselves as well and really look at the balance of risk across our files. So I think we should take a balanced ownership of the kind of issues that arise in our industry. I'll talk briefly, introduce the risk assessment area, and then hand over to Olvia. So I think a lot of this is very common for a lot of our approaches in industry. So I'll not go through too much of the risk assessment methodology, but maybe talk about how risk assessment drives development work. So once we do our risk assessments, we get risk priority number, and we look at how we address that through experimental work. Now, that experimental work will cover a whole range of different risks, and that means that we won't ignore low-risk priorities on our risk assessments. It will be encompassed within a whole spread of work. And it may be developed for efficiency or maximizing our cost of goods, etc. A point that maybe we struggle with is how to communicate that information in the regulatory submissions. There's a huge amount of raw data that we generate at our sites around risk assessments and the depth and the number of different failure modes associated with the different failure effect. And that's difficult to summarize. And some of the issues that we have is different ways of summarizing that information could potentially be misinterpreted at review. And that's an issue we are concerned about. So I think one of the benefits we felt through the discussion with Jobst and Olvia in particular was we took a very relatively simplistic view of how to produce the risk assessment in the file. So everyone's seen the traffic light approach. The regulators really don't like it because it doesn't give any visibility or any understanding behind that. And we understand that, but as I say, we were struggling. This is maybe an enhancement through discussion as to how we could provide a better depth of understanding in the files when we do include risk assessments. So providing some of the risk priority numbers, and then following that up for the major risks to give much more of a justification and a background as to how we arrived at those scorings. And then linking that through to a control strategy. And one way to describe that could be a tabular format of this type, again using a further approach to help give the depth of understanding and justification as to how we arrived at those criteria and understandings. And hopefully that can then link more into the other elements of the file that the assessors will work through. And I think at that point I'll hand over to Olvia.
Thanks. Right. Let's see. Thank you, Frank, for the first part of the presentation. A lot of questions have been presented. I know you have burning questions, and I will try to, with this presentation, this part of the presentation I'm bringing, to give the answers. And then we also have 10 minutes afterwards for discussion. And we also have forum discussions tomorrow. So within these 2 days, we should be able to get the answers to all your questions. Okay, right. I invite everybody to discuss. Anyhow, risk assessment. Well, we had a very nice conversation during these few months about 2 dossiers, 2 products that have been assessed recently. And in the appendix of the presentation, you'll see it in a moment. At the end, there's an appendix with a lot of real-life correspondences of how we did the assessments as regulators and how we corresponded with the industry. So you can follow the questions that were asked about risk assessment for product A and product B. I will not go into the questions. I'll just select one of them and go through it very briefly, just to illustrate one example of one of the questions and points. Anyhow, risk assessment. Before I go into the example, I would like to repeat again that you cannot work with risk assessment if you do not first have your QTPP well presented in the dossier, the quality target product profile. We as assessors in the dossiers really want to see the quality target product profile for enhanced approaches and well, also for traditional approaches, no problem. but we want to know what it is all about. What is the goal to develop the product? And within the quality target product profile, this should always include the efficacy and safety, so to speak, the patient. That's very important. That's what we look at as assessors. That's one. And then the critical quality attributes, we have to know about what are these critical quality attributes. We should list them very clearly in your dossier. So that's what we look at. And then we come to risk assessment. And that is something we pay a lot of attention in these dossiers, especially the enhanced dossiers. So anyhow, in a while I'll just discuss the first question about product A, but what an assessor also looks at when looking at QBD aspect is we always also look at it with a view of common sense for the traditional approach also. What kind of product is it? In this case, they were both product A and B immediate release tablets. And I will present an example of product A, and product A was also immediate release with a drug substance that's not very soluble across the physiological range. So many times in those cases, you know that particle size of drug substance could be a very important fact to look at. And so we focus on that. Within all the information that is presented in dossier, we know, well, okay, that's something you have to use common sense. That's for sure. That should be included in the dossier. Right, so now I come to the first the example, and the rest I'll give it to you, so you can all read it through when you're up to it. But the first example is about product A, and one of the questions was quality risk assessment review. Severity expresses the impact of a failure mode on quality, even if detectability is increased, thereby reducing the risk priority numbers. This does not allow reducing the individual severity scores. Risk priority numbers are also reduced, invoking better failure mode detectability thanks to discriminatory dissolution and uniformity tests. However, these tests are not performed in routine. That's very important. Risk review approach should be reconsidered. That was the question literally as it was presented. The background, well, I'll show you a very nice figure that was in the dossier. This is about product A, and it shows the risk priority numbers of certain potential failure modes. And you see that the red, and green, yellow, bars, and they all have a meaning. The red is high risk, and then the yellow one is medium, and the other one is the green one is low risk. And the arrows, and you see that the risk priority numbers has been decreased by the arrow for certain potential failure modes, including in changes in epi particle size properties, what I just mentioned a while ago. And well, there were already also other aspects that had influence on this solution, but because that was what this is all about. Not only changes in particle size, but increased level binder, the decreased level disintegrant, that was something having impact, and wet mass overgranulation. Anyway, the company gave us a very detailed response, and we have it summarized here. The full version is in the appendix, that the quality risk assessment was performed prior to the pivotal clinical study. That's very important. That is the fact that company made clear to us. It is first, it was before the clinical study it was presented and made, and it was to prioritize further work. Severity scored highest due to lack of knowledge of impact. Tablets with broad range failure modes were then tested in vivo in the clinical study. And it turned out that dissolution performance had lower impact on in vivo performance. And so thereby the severity scores could be reduced. So risk prioritization remained the same, but overall risk level reduced. I repeat, the risk prioritization remained the same. That's something we keep in our back, at the back of the head. It was assessed as acceptable. It was sufficiently justified. We were very, very satisfied with the answer. So, okay, so now I come to a point that I would like to give a summary of how we have experienced as assessors these dossiers, and not only the two dossiers of product A and B, but also dossiers in general of QBD. It is our summary, Job's, Lindberg, and mine, that it is positive to remark that the applicants use suitable procedures like risk analysis and design of experiments to evaluate the potential risks. The tool most often used is the FMEA, and the results are nowadays in general comprehensively documented. Part of this text is colored, and it is to focus on to explain that in the beginning it was different, but nowadays it's getting better, and that's what we would like to see. And another point is other techniques to additionally summarize all potential parameters in a nutshell, like fishbone diagrams, are only sometimes used by the applicants, but we are encouraged that they are being used as much as possible. It makes life easier for us and for assessors because, well, we have all this paperwork to go through. And it is noted that in some cases that the goal of the risk management was not to minimize the risk for the patient, but for economic reasons. That is one of the reasons that the companies give, but this would normally not be included in the assessment. We just look over this. It's important for the manufacturing and for the company, but not for the assessment. Okay, so that was a summary that Jobst and I had made about what were our experiences. And next slide is what I would like to present, is because what we are experiencing now in these couple of years of making policy and documents and guidelines and Q&As for quality by design, that they are evolving. This is one of the earliest documents, and it was also not on the side of the European side, but it was the ICH side. And what was the basic policy for risk assessment, according to the site, and it was also part of the point to consider, the relationship between risk and criticality. Risk includes severity of harm, probability of occurrence, and detectability, and therefore the level of risk can change as a result of risk management. Quality attribute criticality is primarily based upon severity of harm and does not change as a result of risk management. Process parameter criticality is linked to the parameter's effect on any critical quality attribute. It is based on the probability of occurrence and detectability, and therefore can change as a result of risk management. Now, these last few words, they are very risky, because this is not being interpreted as such anymore by, in general, other regulators. Once a process parameter is critical, it remains critical. Whether you reduce the risk by with risk management or not, it remains critical. If it is once critical, it remains critical. But it's just also to let you know how policy evolves and we are all learning. And I invite you to discuss this point as well at the end of the presentation. Okay, so I've put on slides a summary of what assessors want to see in dossiers, QBD dossiers, when it comes to risk assessment. Risk assessment should be carried out initially and be repeated throughout the development in order to assess how far the identified risks have become controllable. The time point of the risk assessment should be clearly stated. A summary of all material quality attributes and process parameters which may have an impact on product quality should be presented. Often, only a summary table is presented in the dossier without explaining how the risks have been classified. This is not sufficient. The risk assessment tool, such as FMEA, should be stated, and the scoring and thresholds used to classify the risks should be explained. It should be checked whether all known risk factors have been included, such as degradation. Risk ranking outcomes not in line with the existing scientific knowledge should be justified. The link between risk assessment and drug substance, drug product specification should be clear. The absence of potential critical quality attributes in the specification should be justified. And it should be checked whether the identified risks are managed by the design space or the proposed control strategy. Information on the applicant's experts carrying out the risk assessment is not required. Good example for a risk assessment table is presented in the training material in the ICH IWG on the implementation of Q8, 9, 10. It's in the appendix. Okay, risk assessment is linked to critical process parameters. So that's why I've added a few slides about process parameters, because they have to be taken into the assessment as well. There's often some uncertainty about the terms used in this context in the dossier. From a regulatory point of view, any parameter which might have an impact on the patient's health is considered critical. Even if a critical parameter is adequately controlled, it will still be a critical parameter. I just mentioned that a while ago. A complete list of process parameters plus assessment of their criticality should be submitted. No terms like key, major, minor should be used, only ICH terms. The criticality assessment of all the process parameters during the development process should be described. The ongoing process of risk assessment during development should be monitored. Risk mitigation and or parameter classified non-critical on first sight may become critical due to unexpected results during scale-up. Critical parameters may have a significant influence on critical quality attributes of the drug product. Non-critical parameters do not have significant influence on critical quality attributes of the drug product. And the last slide is, well, an example of criticality assessment in a drug substance manufacturing process, showing that, well, the level of degradation products impurity B, that it depends very much on certain aspects. Like in this example given, it is the limit for reagent B is very important to keep it in under control. I will not go into, but that is a very good example in the dossier presented, and I think that later on that Frank will present some more of these kind of examples. Well, what are the learnings and best practices of risk assessment according to the regulators? Well, we think that this appeals to companies and regulators. Comprehensiveness and plausibility is important in the presentation of the data. quantitative results and thresholds is what we would like to see. If qualitative results are presented, they could be acceptable once they are thoroughly justified. Comparison to similar products evaluated before could be useful. Please do it. And acceptance of prior knowledge of the applicant in the assessment of the risk is also very useful. Assessors should not do their own risk assessment. They should be able to depend on the data provided in a very clear way by the company. Asking lots of questions about details on raw data collected during development is not necessary. That is specifically to assessors in general. I provoke you for the discussion that it is not necessary for the marketing authorization procedure. I think that it's up to the company to present a clear summary, and it should be comprehensive and logical. So that was the part of the regulator's part, and I will hand over the mic to Frank again, so he'll go on with life cycle management. Yeah, thank you.
Right. Excellent, thank you, Olvia. Okay, so what happens when we get products approved? And I think this is key because, as we mentioned at the forefront of this, we've been talking about these concepts for quite some time. But the reality is, well, what happens when we get approval and we start manufacturing these products? And we hit problems, because we always do. And if we think we don't, we're deluding ourselves. There are always issues in manufacture through a whole range of reasons. So for us, we thought this was a really important topic to discuss. And really, it puts a lot of challenge into the quality management system and change management as a key attribute of that. How do we translate some of this information into the master batch record? I think that's been a key question from a lot of assessors in terms of when they've been reviewing files. What does this look like at the site? Change and deviation management. How's that dealt with? How do you know? How do you have the clarity of decision making? Risk assessment through the life cycle and for continuous improvement, and you could add knowledge management in there as well. Absolutely key things that that rise even more to the fore as you maybe take a less traditional product through the approval and into manufacture. I put the heading of sort of how to manage design space through the life cycle, and this is maybe an example of where inadvertently you could potentially escalate the level of variation associated with a process parameter because of the nature of chemistry and the product understanding. So the regulator's perspective, and we understand this and accept this, is that the design space changes are classified as type 2 variations because they should only be associated with critical process parameters and critical material attributes. But as you can see, with this is the output from a design of experiments. The darker shaded areas reflect areas that are closer to an edge of failure and therefore fall into the categorization of critical. But there are a lot of very, very light shaded areas in that diagram. This is a fact. This is the reality of what you get whenever we do the experimental designs, that there are sort of a range of criticality. But we accept that there is a requirement that we must register two-sided ranges associated with our manufacturing processes. So you can see how quickly you could end up incorporating elements if you use a design space in this type of approach, where suddenly you're forced into a variation category that could be really not in sequence with the knowledge of the process. And in these kind of situations, AstraZeneca's approach would not be to define a design space for this particular example, because we would see the potential downsides as impeding our opportunities to be able to improve that process. So a key learning for us. Now, that's not to say that design spaces does not add value. We have some examples in-house where we use this. This is an example of one of our products, highly disguised, but where we have an adaptive process, where we have maybe different qualities of input material attributes, 1 and 2, that can come into a process. And those then have to use different process parameter ranges to be able, through a model, to be able to achieve the desired dissolution performance that you see with the model and versus without that model. And to me, that's a real valuable way of using that concept and getting that concept explained across through the assessment and review process. Another real example, and we talked about this over breakfast this morning, and Oyvind is smiling at the minute. So he helped me practice this. New information. We had a deviation from a temperature set point during our commercial manufacture of one of these products. It caused a failure, but we hadn't defined this in the manufacture in the MAA because we hadn't identified it as being important. Now, it happened as a consequence of a deviation. But how do we interpret this change? We did a lot of head scratching. We even asked some colleagues in different companies what their approach would be. It was complicated further because there was a design space registered for a part of the process closely associated with that. So some approaches within the company would have said, well, there's no variation required because it's not registered in the MAA. Another sort of more extreme version could be, it could be a type 2 variation. Now, we really didn't believe it was appropriate to submit a type 2 variation where we had identified through a root cause analysis and we're looking to improve our process. That just seemed incongruous with the whole concept of quality by design and continuous improvement. But how that could delay. Eventually, we filed this as a type 1B, as an unforeseen. Basically, we couldn't really figure out where else to safely submit. And that was successfully approved, and Olvia provided us some feedback on that. But in this kind of situation, design space did confuse our thinking. Maybe with the learning that we have, we would dissociate that with our internal assessments nowadays. But if you take that into the concept of the site and a QP, you escalate the number of people that have to share the same view. It makes problems. And I suppose points for discussion are, and we had issues with this, should we really continue to make a product by a process that we know that is much less robust whilst we're waiting for the approvals of these types of variations? And that was a real hard question we had to face in the company. And we didn't like the answer that our compliance organization gave to us because we felt from a science and a patient perspective, it wasn't the right one. So really a question is, how can we make these types of changes be implemented more quickly through our quality management systems? I know this poses problems. I know this poses legislative questions, but this is what we want to achieve, I think, for manufacturing our products and improving our quality to our patients. And this is some feedback that came from the agency assessment of that. And I'll not go into too much detail to save some time for questions. And here, I shall do my best, Emil, but thank you very much for giving me some of your insights on the inspector's perspective of how to inspect a site that's manufacturing a product with an enhanced approach. And these are Emil's slides, and this is derived from a discussion from within the MPA inspectorate as to how they would deal with these kind of issues and what their concerns would be. And I suppose a key point in all of this is often the location of the knowledge is not in the same place as the manufacture is occurring. And that creates risk. And it creates risk through the life cycle, because how is that knowledge that's being generated in the manufacturing site being captured by the site that has created that knowledge and should be maintaining that knowledge as well? So a key point. Another issue that I know is creates problems with agencies globally and practical challenges for Europe is the collaboration between assessors and inspectors. And where our products are going to go in the future, I think there's going to be a lot more expectation on inspectors to be able to manage these products through the life cycle, and a lot more focus in that area if we are to truly take advantage of the knowledge that we have of our products in manufacture and improve the efficiency by which we do that. But I know that there have been some steps taken, and certainly I've heard examples where assessors have attended inspections to support those kind of activities. So those are good steps, but I think through some of the discussion topics that needs to continue. And what will an inspector review? And this is in addition to the typical systems inspection. So how has the technology transfer been conducted? How is product knowledge captured? And we talked about this through the development of the product. What's the quality management system? What are the quality agreements? How are those overseen? What input does the company have on approving those? And things like definition of a deviation. I think this was a key discussion point whenever we were developing this slide. What is a deviation? Can we be clear exactly what a deviation is, especially when a design space has been described? If we have a design space that has also non-critical parameters described over that aspect of the process, is it a deviation to deviate from those parameters? The most conservative view is yes, it is, because they're described. But is that everyone's interpretation? Because we can get in trouble from different interpretations. And handling change control, exactly the same kind of judgmental issue arises there. How do we know that it's been done correctly? And how do different agencies take a different perspective on that? Because it comes down then to the QP's perspective of, at inspection, will they be able to defend appropriately to every agency that inspects that site, the decisions that they've made. I won't go into all the detail of this slide because I'm sure you can read it, and this is probably me just trying to retain my sort of claim that I'm still a scientist, even though I'm in regulatory now. But really, all this slide is trying to show is the output of a design of experiments, and it's really just trying to say that one element of a time parameter here is important for quality. Another element isn't. But because of a requirement, that we do provide dual-sided ranges in our submissions, that sort of higher level limit was introduced into our manufacturing process. And we picked a value that was defined as a consequence of our multivariate experimentation, because we thought that was more consistent with the approach that we'd done for the manufacture. However, as I'm sure the inspectors in the audience will well know, and the people that work at operations manufacturing sites, things happen. And there was a deviation that delayed the in-process test to 15 hours instead of the upper limit of 12. Problem. Could the batch be released? Well, from a quality side, we already know, even when we were notified of this issue, that the quality would not be affected, because we'd already done lots of experimentation and understood our process incredibly well. And that was confirmed as part of the deviation investigation. But from a regulatory perspective, the concern was this is non-compliant with the MAA. So the QP is left with the choice. This could be considered a deficiency during a future site inspection. So yes, the quality was fine. No, the regulatory issues were a problem. So no release. And that's where that situation sits at this point in time. We could change the range through a variation, but this is a one-off situation. It would seem a really pointless exercise in creating variations every time a single one-off issue arises. But at this point, there is no perceived regulatory mechanism to permit the QP's discretion to release this in a consistent fashion across Europe. So I think some of the points here are, how can we use enhanced knowledge and a robust quality management system to avoid rejecting batches of suitable quality during production? We don't want to do that. We recognize that we can't allow our manufacturing units to operate out of control, and that is an absolute requirement. But shouldn't we be able to use quality by design and enhanced understanding to facilitate effective deviation resolution? And I think this brings to the fore, and this is the beauty of this conference, where we have inspectors and assessors, and also, I should say, QA and regulatory from industry groups in the same room, able to address how we can address these kind of issues. So I'll finish very quickly now, just with these couple of high-level points. For design space to be of value, we really need to understand what it means in practice, because we have been learning, but I don't think we're there yet. And can we leverage companies' quality management systems, inspection records, knowledge of the product to reduce change burden and manage deviations? And you've seen some examples where that's become real. And we do need a common understanding across assessors, inspectors, sites, QPs, and I could extend that to regulatory affairs departments and development scientists as well. Because it's only there that we get good, productive decisions. And at that point, I'll stop and ask for any clarifications or questions, but leave that in the hands of the committee. So thank you.
I have a question. Ferdinando Spesi from Novartis, and obviously I am expressing myself not as Novartis, okay? So, but in general, as a question, you mentioned that, okay, if I have one-time deviation outside my quality by design space and so on, you are saying that, and I'm talking now when we are in real manufacturing, you are saying that from the quality standpoint, the product is fine. And I want to underline one thing. Quality means that the CQAs are related to clinical and safety, okay? Because otherwise it's not meaning anything. And you are saying, no, this from the regulatory standpoint is not acceptable. I believe that as quality unit and quality assurance, and therefore potentially as a QP, there is nothing written in the law in Europe probably. The company has the right to make that assessment if it's a one-time event. And not just saying everything needs to go to the regulators, because if that would be a trend, I would understand the point. But I'm not aligned with what you said. So I don't know if you want to answer it. I would say we need to challenge this kind of approaches, because otherwise everything goes to the regulators forever.
And before I'll answer quickly from the AstraZeneca view and then hand over to David. But what I was putting across there was the considered view and the approach that was taken within AstraZeneca. And I think that's where, and I'd like David to answer this, but I think this comes to the last point on the slide that I've got showing at the minute, that we need that good understanding, not just between the inspectors and the assessors, but also within our companies.
Yeah, I was not criticizing AstraZeneca. I was making a kind of provocation, in good sense.
I'm happy to float it, because we wouldn't have put it out there if we weren't happy to discuss.
Hi, David Coburn here, Head of Manufacturing and Quality Compliance. This is quite an interesting topic that I'm a bit surprised at what appears to be in the discussion with the regulators, because this kind of thing has been addressed in a reflection paper published many years ago following discussion that a group put together at the heads of agencies level. It went to that level that there needed to be something done to put some pragmatic advice together for QPs when they're faced with these kind of one-off deviation situations. So there is a paper there which is endorsed by the regulators. And okay, there may be some particular aspect of this that is not clear from the presentation, but in principle, this seems to fall within the scope of that paper as a one-off deviation. And I think in this particular case where there is actually some good knowledge from the development that can be used to justify the use of what's called QP discretion. This seems to be a classic case that fits well into that particular piece of guidance, which I have to say the principles of that will be put into the current ongoing revision of Annex 16. The intention is to take some of the principles of that reflection paper and put them into the Annex 16. So it's actually, from a regulatory standpoint, it's a bit clearer than just a reflection paper as such. So there may be something that I'm overlooking in this particular case, but it seems to fall within what would be deemed as acceptable in the reflection paper, this particular one at least.
Good morning, Frank. Ron Ogilvie from Pfizer. I'd like to thank the case study group for the work that they've done to present such a broad topic to us first. I think we could almost have a full day's discussion on the topics that you've raised. I feel bad to then come back to only make one point, because I think there's so many discussion points in this. But the one that I was really interested in was the discussion around risk assessment. How does the regulators want to see it? How deep does one go? One of the things that I've reflected on, certainly personally, is how difficult quality by design-based submission can be, and how scientific it needs to be, and how many detailed corners one needs to go into. My fear is that if a company focuses its submission through its risk assessment, you present every corner of every decision you make in development, and it gets very complicated very quickly. So I wonder, and it will come up again through the day, I think, I wonder if rather than turning to the depths of the risk assessment, one can look at, I agree with you, you look at the quality target product profile, you look at the quality critical attributes, and then you've got a choice. Do you then look at the risk assessment, or do you look at the control strategy? And I wonder if one of the ways is actually a simpler way to get the story across in a clear manner between the two parties. My fear is that risk assessment, quantitative scoring is actually the hardest way to get the story across. So I hope that this kind of discussion will continue, but fantastic breadth of topics from the AZ case study. Thank you.
May I give a response from a regulator's perspective? I would say, well, it's case by case. It depends on the product and the process. A very complicated product and process will need a more complicated risk assessment. If it's straightforward and you could, by thinking logically, also predict what could be risk or not, that would also make a difference in the assessment. So, as I said a while ago in my presentation, that you follow the principles, but you also keep in mind what kind of product is it, who is it presented to, is it well, a narrow therapeutic range, etc., etc. All those things count. So there's no general answer to your question. It's case by case.
Olivia, thank you. I think that's a very good clarification. I appreciate that, and complexity does play a role. I still think that as you put your submission together, there's a possibility that you, as a regulator, have a view on what control strategies may need to be, what the manufacturing process commitments would need to be, and maybe you focus then the story through the differences, the flexibilities, the changes that the industry are putting forwards. I think to try and look at every angle on a risk assessment is actually a very complicated thing for the company to get across, and every company might do it subtly differently, whereas the controls that are needed are something that you as a regulator can hold to a consistent standard.
Just want to add to what Olvia has said, and I'm glad, Ron, that you already started the discussion on control strategy, and it's what I said a little in the introduction. I think we have is really the idea, or should we go into the direction that we focus very much more and more on control strategy? For me, control strategy is one element, of course, a very important element, that's for sure. But how would you want to a regulator to understand a company's control strategy? He has not a broad idea about what is risk or what, if not the risk assessment, has been done by the company. So it's always which should come first. Should we have a control strategy and then neglect risk assessment, or should we first have the risk assessment in order to understand the control strategy of the company and then to agree to the control strategy? So this is a debate. I do not want to go into detail now, but this is for sure something which we need to further. I think we notice for the day too yeah. that this may be a rather broader discussion here.
Please. Martijn van der Plas from the Dutch agency. I'm into biologics, so I'm completely new to this, at least to this specific case. However, there's an interesting point. You say, well, wasn't quality by design meant to enable process improvements? Well, you might argue in a strong sense it is not, or at least in a more moderate sense that there's a tension between, on one hand, it's quality by design means that you have your quality and everything designed beforehand, so there is no need to improve. On the other hand, you want and you need some improvement afterwards. So there's seems to be some fundamental tension in this concept, and this is, I think, so to say, the root cause of your problem with these deviations. There were parts of your design space where the borders of this design space were not 100% explored and fully established. And as a consequence of that, not, well, you might say not laid down in a dossier in an appropriate or optimal way. And it seems, well, it seems that either the dossier could be improved, or, as remarked, this seems to be, if it's really a one-off, then indeed it might be indeed at QP discretion, depending on the particularity of the cases. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can just pick up on that, because I think some of your points are really important, and I suppose it takes me to the presumption that through the life cycle of a product, that a design space will be never any additional information or understanding of the product or consequential impacts of something that you haven't explored will have an impact on product quality. I think the reality is that happens. And I don't think really that I could stand here and say that a design space that is developed will always produce product of consistent quality, because there will be things that change at the manufacturing site that may have an impact on that you're just not aware of. And I think that's where the importance of the quality management system and how we monitor and track our products through that really is hugely important, because we are basing our initial assessments on a smaller data set than we will have in manufacture. So I think that's the reality, and sort of I think what we're seeing with the concepts that we've developed through Q8 through to Q11 is that when we take those concepts into real practice, we start to see what we need to learn and how we need to understand how we respond to those. And I think we're in that phase at this point in time.
Leticia Martinez, I'm quality assessor. Just a reaction to your last comment. Indeed, I think the question is, it may happen, but the question is, how frequently do you anticipate this happens? And another key point for me is that have sufficiently or reasonably wide ranges been initially investigated to cope with this need for updates. And I think really in this point, QP cannot compensate for ranges that have not been sufficiently investigated during development if this becomes a systematic change.
Yes, and I suppose if I would reflect on ranges explored in the file, usually, and with the file associated with that deviation, we had good data, but also fundamental understanding of the mechanistics of how those processes worked, and really what types of impurities could arise as a consequence of any variance from those ranges. So I think it can really depend on the depth of data that underpins the experimentation that goes to support the ranges in the file, because and I think this is a really important point, that some of the ranges that are the data that supports the ranges is only the tip of the iceberg, based on the real understanding of how that process works. So we could see an impurity arising as a consequence of a deviation, but we may already understand completely the root of how that impurity has arisen. And I think that's where the strength comes. And I think how often we vary from set points or ranges, I think really, hopefully, if we've done our work properly, that doesn't happen very often, but it will happen. So maybe answered some of your question directly and some of it in an indirect fashion. Sean?
Sean Jones, Quality Assessor, MHRA. I wish to talk about, I thought your information regarding product A and product B was very interesting. And you provided data showing that the dissolution of specially prepared product A batches did not have an influence in vivo. But that was a surprise to me because in an early slide you said that product A contains a drug substance which is BCS class 4. So you have your prior knowledge and understanding of the science of the nature of drug substances saying dissolution does have an impact in vivo, is rate limiting, and then you're presenting data showing that it isn't. And so the question I wanted to ask, did you develop an understanding as why dissolution, in the particular case of product A, did not have an impact, was not rate limiting with respect to in vivo bioavailability?
Sean, you've been paying an awful lot of attention, and as my work group informed me on Friday after we'd sent those slides in, I think the products were tagged slightly differently. So the product A and B has switched. So the point that you're making was associated with product B. Sorry. so you.
B is BCS class 2 then.
Yes.
And it's still the same thing arises. So that
yeah, and with product B, it's highly soluble across a lot of the physiological range, and so it's really only at the higher end of the BCS of the pH range that you see it dropping into the formal BCS classification. So for most of that, it's actually demonstrating BCS class 1 like behavior. But thank you for picking up the obvious mistake in our slides.
The point I'm making, though, is that sometimes the results can be surprising.
Yes.
From in taking into account the context of your prior knowledge, and that they need to be explained. Even though they might show something, they need to be explained in some way.
Yeah, and I think that was the example that Olvia gave from the risk assessment. That's why we used that as one of the illustrative examples in the presentation, because that was the data that we generated that enabled the severity of that potential failure mode to be dropped, because we were seeing that clear BCS class 1 like behavior, and it's a consequence of the classification being black and white.